There is a number sitting inside Microsoft's own investor materials right now that the company has never said out loud in a keynote, and once you hear it, you will understand exactly why so many ordinary people quietly stopped defending Windows in the last 12 months, because this is not a story about hackers or hobbyists or people who have always hated Microsoft on principle. This is a story about millions of completely average users, the kind who never once thought about their operating system until the operating system started thinking a little too much about them. And it started, like most slow motion breakups do, with something that looked small at the time in October 2025. Microsoft finally pulled the plug on Windows 10, and inside Microsoft the expectation was simple: a short wave of complaints, a news cycle that would fade in a week, and a mass migration into Windows 11 that would look, on paper, like a total victory. And for a majority of users, that is roughly what happened. But underneath that headline, eye in the data, almost nobody was watching closely enough at the time. Something else was building. An operating system that had spent 30 years as the punchline of every tech joke ever written was climbing faster than it had ever climbed before. And the honest, uncomfortable truth Microsoft has to sit with is that it built almost every condition for that climb itself. So let's actually walk through how this happened, in order, the way it happened to the people living through it. Because the breaking point for most of these switchers was never one dramatic event. It was water rising slowly in a room until one day the water was simply over their heads, and the first crack appeared back in 2024 with a feature called Recall, Microsoft's flagship pitch for its new Copilot Plus PCs. And the way Recall worked was that it captured a screenshot of your screen every few seconds, continuously, storing them locally, indexing them with AI so you could search your own computer usage like a diary you never agreed to keep. Microsoft framed it as convenience. Find anything you've ever seen just by describing it. But security researchers found something else almost immediately: a searchable, time-stamped archive of every website, every document, every private message, every image that had ever crossed that screen, sitting in a database that, in its earliest form, had serious, embarrassing security holes. And the backlash was loud enough and fast enough that Microsoft delayed the feature by an entire year before quietly shipping a version of it. But a delay does not undo what a delay reveals, because it told millions of people exactly how the company now thought about the machine sitting on their desk. And instead of reading that reaction as a signal to slow down, Microsoft did the opposite. It sped up, and through 2025, a colorful Copilot icon started appearing inside Notepad, inside Paint, inside File Explorer, inside the snipping tool, inside Photos. Not as something you could opt into if you wanted it, but as a permanent fixture wedged into applications people had used in their simple, quiet forms for decades. Microsoft even put a dedicated Copilot key on new keyboards, a physical button whose only job was to summon an AI assistant a growing number of people were actively trying to delete. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a piece of community slang started spreading fast enough that Microsoft reportedly had it banned from its own official forums, which might be the single most self-defeating response a company can give to a joke about itself. And when the president of Windows publicly announced plans to turn the operating system into what he called an agentic OS and got buried under thousands of negative replies, he didn't respond. He simply switched off the reply button. And that detail alone tells you almost everything about who is currently steering the ship. And underneath all of that AI expansion, the basic reliability of the operating system was quietly falling apart in ways that felt directly connected. Because 2025 was, by almost any honest measure, one of the worst years for Windows update quality in recent memory. Microsoft shipped a patch that accidentally deleted Copilot itself, shipped another that duplicated entries inside Task Manager, shipped a security update that broke the boot process on business machines so badly that Microsoft's own advisory described the result as an improper state. File Explorer developed lingering performance problems. Dark Mode had a white screen flash bug that should never have survived internal testing. Remote Desktop kept disconnecting for months with no fix. And the January 2026 update needed 2 separate emergency patches within days of each other, one for machines that refused to shut down, one for OneDrive and Dropbox crashing outright. And IT administrators on Microsoft's own community forums started writing that they could no longer trust a single patch on release day, delaying updates by 90 days just to see what would break first. The old joke about Patch Tuesday turning into Uninstall Wednesday stopped being a joke somewhere around here and became an actual documented policy inside real IT departments. And while all of this was unfolding, the privacy situation was quietly getting worse in ways most users only discovered when they went digging on purpose. Because Windows 11 in 2026 runs multiple layers of data collection at once, covering how you use the system, which apps you open, how long you stay in them, your hardware setup, your network details. And on the Home and Pro editions, the only options sitting inside your settings are required diagnostic data or full diagnostic data. The setting that sends almost nothing back to Microsoft exists, but it is locked away for enterprise and education customers only, and ordinary home user does not get that choice, no matter how carefully they search their own settings menu, and the advertising had become so normalized that most people had simply stopped consciously noticing it. Promotional tiles for Microsoft 365 and Xbox Game Pass sitting inside the Start menu, tips and tricks on the lock screen that are functionally paid placements, a brand new installation greeting you with pre-pinned icons for apps Microsoft was paid to put there. And then in April 2026, on a quarterly investor call, Satya Nadella himself said out loud that Microsoft needed to do foundational work to win back consumer trust, that the aggressive default behavior pushing people toward Edge, Bing, and Copilot had damaged the company's relationship with its own users. And when a CEO uses an earnings call to admit his product is quietly losing fans, that is not a fringe complaint anymore. That is a number large enough to show up in the company's own financial narrative. But if you ask the people who actually made this switch which single factor pushed them the hardest, most of them will point somewhere else entirely, to the hardware requirements. Because when Windows 11 launched, it demanded a TPM 2.0 security chip and a strict list of approved processors. Hundreds of millions of machines that were running Windows 10 perfectly well, doing everything their owners needed without complaint, were suddenly declared incompatible. Computers from 2018 and 2019, only 4 or 5 years old at the time, told flatly that they could not run the new operating system. Microsoft framed the requirement as a security necessity, and the practical result was millions of people with perfectly functional hardware being told their only path forward was to spend money on something new, and the people who simply stayed on Windows 10 past its support date were not being reckless. They were doing basic math. Their machine worked, and Microsoft had drawn an arbitrary line that happened to fall just below their processor's release date. And all of this context is exactly what makes the move to Linux in 2026 feel less like a dramatic statement and more like a rational decision. Because the version of Linux waiting on the other side of that decision is not the version from 15 years ago that demanded comfort with terminal commands and tolerance for hardware that simply refused to work. Gaming alone has changed enough to erase what used to be the single biggest deal breaker. Steam's own hardware survey put Linux gaming above 5% of active users by early 2026, and Valve's Proton compatibility layer now runs well over 90% of the entire Steam library at genuinely playable performance. The Steam Deck, which runs a Linux-based Steam OS by default, put Linux gaming into the hands of millions of people who never once thought of themselves as Linux users and drove real investment in compatibility that benefits every desktop Linux user by extension. Games that would have been an instant deal breaker 4 or 5 years ago now install and run through Proton with almost no friction. And yes, there are still real exceptions. Certain titles running kernel-level anti-cheat systems that are incompatible with Linux by design, but the library that does work is now large enough that most people can switch without abandoning what they actually play. And for anyone actually going through this transition, the distribution that keeps showing up at the top of every serious beginner guide is Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop. And there's a simple reason for that. The taskbar sits at the bottom. The Start menu sits in the lower left. The system tray sits in the lower right. And if you have spent your entire life inside Windows, sitting down in front of Cinnamon feels immediately recognizable instead of alienating. The installation itself, downloading an image, writing it to a USB drive with a free tool, booting from it, running through a setup wizard, is genuinely less complicated at this point than installing Windows 11 itself, which now requires navigating around Microsoft's own attempts to force a Microsoft account, a constant internet connection, and several rounds of service agreements before you ever reach a working desktop. And the first 2 weeks of the switch involve real, honest friction, years of muscle memory reaching for menus that are no longer where they used to be. Right? Click context menus that look different, keyboard shortcuts that are close, but not identical. Software installed through something closer to an app store instead of downloading executables from random websites. And every single person who has documented this transition and given it more than 2 weeks describes the exact same arc without exception. The friction dissolves into comfort, and the comfort eventually turns into preference, and the unfamiliar becomes familiar faster than almost anyone expects. Going in, and the very first thing most switchers notice, the thing that is genuinely impossible to miss, is performance. The same machine that had been quietly straining under Windows 11, fans spinning for tasks that shouldn't need it, boot times creeping upward year over year, memory usage sitting high, even doing nothing, starts behaving like a different piece of hardware entirely once Linux is on it. Boot times dropping under 20 seconds, idle memory usage cut by more than half, applications opening faster, fans staying quiet through normal use. Because Linux simply doesn't carry the background weight that Windows now does. No update agents constantly polling servers, no Copilot processes running even when the app is closed, no advertising system quietly logging behavior in the background. What you get instead is a machine spending its resources on the tasks you actually asked it to do. And the honest conversation people need before switching is about software. Because for most everyday use, the gap has effectively closed. Firefox and Chrome run identically. LibreOffice handles Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files with solid compatibility. VLC plays anything without codec hunting. There are capable free tools for photo and video editing. Google Drive, Dropbox, OneDrive, and Notion all work fine through a browser, Discord, Slack, Zoom, and Signal all ship native Linux versions. And Steam with Proton covers the gaming library. But the caveat has to be said plainly and without spin. Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and After Effects do not run natively on Linux. And if an entire creative workflow depends on Adobe's desktop suite, that is a real limitation, not a minor inconvenience. AutoCAD, certain accounting software, specific industry tools in audio and architecture, and games with aggressive kernel-level anti-cheat remain genuine. Blockers for the people who depend on them, and the sensible middle path a lot of switchers land on is dual booting, keeping a Windows partition alive for the one or two applications with no real Linux equivalent while using Linux as the actual daily driver for everything else. And the dimension people expect to notice first, privacy, delivers almost immediately. No telemetry collection, no account requirement to simply use the machine, no advertising suggestions sitting in the file manager, no sponsored content in the start menu, no feature quietly screenshotting the screen every few seconds, nothing running in the background reporting activity to anyone. The operating system runs the software you asked for and reports that activity to no one at all. And the contrast with what Windows 11 has become in 2026 is not subtle. It is one of the most immediately noticeable differences in the entire daily experience, because the absence of things you had unconsciously stopped registering as intrusive turns out to feel like genuine relief the moment they're gone. And the community reputation Linux carried for being cold or dismissive toward beginners, a reputation that may have had some truth to it. 15s. Years ago, in certain corners of the internet, is almost completely disconnected from what the actual experience looks like now. Forums and communities full of people who remember starting from zero themselves and take real satisfaction in walking someone else through the same transition. Most questions already answered in an existing thread. The rest answered patiently within hours by someone who clearly wants you to succeed. And what almost nobody expects going into this is how quickly the emotional weight of the switch resolves. Because after roughly 2 weeks, the disorientation fades, and what's left behind is something genuinely hard to describe until you've felt it yourself. A computer that feels like it's finally working for you instead of quietly managing you. No nudges towards services you never asked for, no pop-ups asking if you'd like to try a new feature, just the software you opened. Running cleanly, without commentary, and that feeling is the real surprise buried inside this entire story, because it reveals just how much friction people had been unconsciously accepting as normal, simply because they had never experienced the alternative, and once that friction disappears, the contrast with everything that came before becomes impossible to unsee. And to be fair, none of this means Linux is the right call for everyone frustrated with Windows 11. Some people have software dependencies that genuinely require it, and that reality deserves respect rather than dismissal. But the version of Linux available right now in 2026 is categorically different from the version most people still picture in their heads. And the broader pattern proves this isn't just a handful of individual decisions. It's a measurable shift. Google search interest in how to install Linux hit an all-time high in February 2026, roughly 5 times higher than just months earlier. Linux gaming crossed 5% of active Steam users. In March of that year, France mandated that all 2.5 million of its civil servants move their government workstations off Windows and onto Linux by the end of 2026. Germany's Schleswig-Holstein completed 80% of a 30,000 machine migration and reported 15 million euros in savings in a single year. And Microsoft's own Windows president publicly admitted the operating system had drifted off track, while its CEO told investors on the record that winning back consumer trust required foundational work. And when a company's own leadership starts narrating the exodus in its own earnings language, the people leaving are no longer a rounding error. They are a signal the entire industry can see. And none of this means Windows is disappearing. It isn't. But it does mean the old assumption that Linux is too difficult, too incomplete, too risky to trust. As a daily driver has quietly stopped matching reality, the people making this switch right now are mostly not engineers or hobbyists chasing an ideology. They are ordinary people who got tired of being managed by their own computer and went looking for something that finally worked with them instead of against them. And if any part of that sentence sounded uncomfortably familiar while you were watching this, the real question left on the table isn't whether Linux can handle what you actually need it to do. The real question is whether you're finally ready to spend 2 weeks finding out.